Mark Vernon, it's lovely to see you. You've got a book on the way out. Are you excited about publication?
I am, thank you. Yeah, on William Blake. He's one of these authors you spend a lot of time with, and then gradually things emerge. And it's lovely to see the final object. And the publisher's done a very nice job with colour plates and making it sort of look right for this wonderful figure.
Absolutely. What drew you to William Blake as someone to write about?
Well, I live in South London, and that was a big part of it, in fact, because I'm very interested in mystical traditions in general, and particularly how to find ways into Christian mysticism, which to me feels not so straightforward and these days. And so he's sort of my local mystic. He talks about the lovely hills of Camberwell, where I live. And so I knew that he was someone who really had something. He tells you that very directly, to see a world in a grain of sand, heaven in a wildflower, and you know that he's onto something, but quite what happens next is not necessarily straightforward. And a lot of his poetry and even imagery, can be, difficult, challenging. It can feel sort of impenetrable, even as he's also very good at the accessible side too. So joining that all up, really feeling that, well, asking this question: how could Blake speak to me? How could I be drawn, follow this golden string, as he puts it? And so the book is, kind of the product of that. I mean, there's more to go, of course, because at the end of the day, it's about your own transformation, your own formation. You can only really write about what you've has become part of your perception. Um,
Absolutely.
but a,
I
but a
think
good point, I hope.
yeah, I think this is why he's such a fascinating figure, and I love. We'll get into this a bit later on, but in the book, you make him a tremendously practical figure. I think I grew up with a sense of William Blake as someone as a rare visionary who had this extraordinary gift, obviously not just as an artist, but of the way he saw and the way he lived in the world. And I suppose I had a sense that that is the kind of spiritual 1%, and the rest of us are just never going to live that way. We will never get to experience the world that way. And one of the wonderful things about your book is that actually this is available to everybody, and Blake is a very practical guide for getting us there. So I want to dig into that a little bit later on. I thought it might be good to start just briefly with an overview of his life. It's a name that many people will have heard, but perhaps we need to just fill in the basics for people.
Yeah, so look, he's born. It's a really good point, I think, because it underlies why I think he speaks to our times, even though he lived 200 years ago in the Georgian period.
Mm.
So 1757 to 1827 are his dates. So we're talking French Revolution, American Revolution, King George the Third for much of the time, but very tumultuous times for in terms of darkness and light. So on the dark side, Britain at war with France for much of Blake's life, the threat of invasion, a lot of bloodshed across Europe because of the Napoleonic Wars, fear from the French Revolution, but also Britain's empire, mixed bag, of course, we're very aware of that now, but nonetheless, Blake is very inclined to celebrate it, actually, because
Okay.
he felt living in London that the whole world was coming to the place that he lived. And although he didn't have the means to go on the grand tour and certainly not travel to places like India that were very influential on him, nonetheless, a lot of that was coming to London, both in terms of texts, culture, but also figures and people. And so, whilst he was deeply aware of the slave trade, that was, at least in Britain, stopped during his lifetime, he was also aware of the extraordinary possibility, I think, that this cultural mixing, religious and spiritual as well, might bring. And I think a lot of his sense of what the Christian frame can offer
Mm.
was enlivened by engaging with these other traditions, which again feels very contemporary, like a lot of people might be interested in that still.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm struck by the idea you mentioned in the book. Maybe we can explore that a little bit, that Blake was interested in what India might be able to offer. The dates you gave are fascinating because for his life, because this is a time when people are starting in places like Calcutta, British linguists, British religious studies people, all sorts of individuals who are going out to India who perhaps are already in the early stages of what later becomes a kind of crisis of faith in the West. And they become interested in what India might be able to offer them: philosophical traditions, spiritual traditions. Names like William Jones become big in that. Samuel Taylor Coleridge takes a little bit of influence from India in his poetry. I've never yet encountered Blake as part of that group. So perhaps you could tell us how he fits into that.
Yes, I mean, I don't know whether you like the phrase or not, but the sense of what sometimes I think called the Oriental Renaissance,
Yeah, yeah.
and whatever the way that needs to be nuanced, I think it does at least give you the sense that this is in the air, and if you're at all interested in culture and ideas, you're going to encounter it in the soirees. Another facet of the time is this is the period of the blue stockings and other sort of interested curiosity kind of groups, and so whilst there's no tangible evidence that Blake engaged, there is very clear evidence nonetheless. So some of his books with his annotations do survive, and for the way that he annotated the translation of the Bhagavad Gita, for example, that would be wonderful. But he knew Charles Wilkins, who was a translator. It's published in 1785. He also he painted images of Brahmins and things. Again, they don't actually survive, but they're listed in catalogues. So there is this material track of his engagement with the ideas coming in from the East India Company. But in a way, it comes alive when you read his work. And two particular types of work I think are valuable here. One is his mysticism and his names, particularly in the latter stages of his life. He creates these wonderful mythological characters. Some are very familiar, like Urizen and Los. Others less so. But a key one, particularly in his later work, is his figure Vala. And she is a figure who veils things. And I'm sure that the name Vala is a pun on Maya. The sort of the way that sight gets occluded, that ignorance can rule perception. And so veiling Maya becomes Vala in Blake. But then people have also looked at some of his images, particularly, say, imagery of the Last Judgment, which is a familiar image in Christian art. But Blake gives it a distinctly Indian twist. Because, I mean, if you imagine Michelangelo's, famous Sistine Chapel, Last Judgment, it's a very kind of vertical image. And you're either going one way or the other. The sort of cosmos, if you like, is being split and separated. But Blake's images of the Last Judgment are very clearly cyclical. What is sort of falling on one side of the image is rising again on the other. And so art critics who are familiar with the way that the Indian sort of cosmic imagery includes that kind of cycle have spotted these resonances for Blake. So it seems very likely that not only did he read texts like the Bhagavad Gita, but that he must have seen some of the art that was coming in and felt that resonated with his perception of things.
Gosh, that would make sense, wouldn't it? Because we'll talk in a minute about Blake's interest in, that famous phrase, cleaning the doors of perception. Because you get a lot of Europeans interested in India in this period, partly because there seems to be a focus in Indian thought on contemplative wisdom, on a way of seeing the world differently, perhaps putting aside the more fideistic parts, at least of Christianity. So people that felt they wanted to move away from that and think more in terms of how we see the world, how we might live and practice so that we see the world. It makes sense that he would be a part of that tradition. Can I read one line of his that you have in the book that I think gets us into this? Can I read this, and perhaps you can tell us a little bit about it and how it leads us into this great project of Blake trying to help us see the world anew. So it's the beginning of one of his books. Blake describes encountering a fairy who mocks him with the line, "5 windows light the caverned man." So perhaps you could take up the story from there. Why is he being mocked? Why is that a mocking turn of phrase?
So the 5 windows are the 5 senses, sight and sound and so on. And Blake constantly references the senses, partly because he's an artist, of course, but partly because really a quite new theory of perception was being developed that's become the dominant theory of perception in the West now. And this is the idea associated with figures like John Locke in particular, but David Hume, Adam Smith, contemporaries of Blake were working on it too. And then it's become the standard model of perception and consciousness in neuroscience and philosophers interested in that now, that we're sort of stuck in our skulls behind these doors of perception, the senses, sound. And Blake felt that there was something deeply mistaken about that. And so when he says, if the doors of perception were cleansed, he's not talking about some kind of peak experience, I don't think, which is how he's been taken, some sort of exceptional unveiling. He's actually quite, and I think Blake often does this, he's quite deliberately criticizing a worldview of philosophy and saying that is where our imaginations have got twisted and contorted. And so he wants to unveil that. So when he encounters the fairy at the beginning of this one of his poems, Europe, and the fairy mocks human senses, what the fairy is mocking is this sense that somehow they sort of connect you, but they also disconnect you. They kind of give you like a bit of a glimpse through the cavern of the human mind, but also remind you of how you're also separated from the rest of the world, which of course is the implication of the idea that, my consciousness is mine, somehow extruded from the brain. Your consciousness is yours, somehow extruded from the brain. And if we're lucky, we kind of, find some sort of meeting halfway, but that meeting in itself is a reminder that we're separate too. And Blake, he also uses phrases like pity divides the soul. And whilst he can be very much, in sympathy with pity, he also realized that if you imagine that your felt connection with another human being is sort of reaching across an almost unbridgeable divide, then it reminds you of your division rather than of your unity, your oneness. And so this sense that I think, is explicit in the Vedantic tradition, say, and so in the commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita that pick that up, which I think Blake must have known about. This helps him to develop a philosophy that existed before in the West, of participation rather than separation. So the senses become portals and thresholds, rather than doors and blocks. And I think that's why he wants to run with it. The fairy, the fairy is a kind of trickster sort of character. It, as you say, it kind of rocks your consciousness and makes you question. And so the fairy continues in this moment and says, I'll show you a world where every particle of dust breathes forth its joy. And, that wonderful poetic expression in itself is almost an invitation. Can I really know the world like that in spite of what everybody's telling me otherwise?
Yeah, and for Blake, one thing I took from the book was that participatory way of experiencing reality is something that I think you trace in the book, at least to very early in childhood. So the experiences are there from very early life, and it's only, of course, gradually that he works them into his art, and then he perhaps develops them into a kind of a philosophy, as you're saying. How far back in his life do these experiences go, and how does he start to make sense of them?
Well, there's a nice anecdote that Catherine Blake one day said, that William first saw God at the age of 4. And the story is that, God somehow sort of peers through a window and freaks the young Blake out. I mean, I imagine that Blake lived with the sense of a world that's also here, and sometimes showing up in a felt sense, sometimes showing up visually, auditorily. And then, he even will describe conversations and encounters as well. I imagine he lived with that probably all day, every day, actually. It's one of the things which I think you really need to grapple with if you want Blake to speak to you, and not just explain such things so as to explain it away, which is a tendency nowadays, to diagnose, he had hyperphantasia or aphantasia or, migraine-based hallucinations, or scholars reach for all sorts of things to keep themselves secure in their materialism, if you like.
Yes.
They don't really want Blake to shake them up like the fairy shook Blake up. But I'm saying no. You miss something fundamental to Blake. if you do that.
Mm.
And so, yeah, you know, these. But he also says, you know, this isn't exceptional. And so I've really reflected on how there might be a spectrum here. You know, someone like
Right.
Blake might see these things more clearly and keenly, and because of a lifetime of self-training, be able to
Mm.
really run with them. But
Mm.
how can we lean into the intimations that we might have? You know, how can a synchronicity not just be a bizarre coincidence that you don't really know what to do with, but
Mm.
perhaps be a doorway? You know, how can attending more to the heart and the felt sense of things, leaning into that, what might it reveal? And, you know, I work as a psychotherapist, and we have fancy words for this, transference and countertransference, but I think
Mm.
it's part of the same thing. And the minute you start to do that, you realize, not directly, but it does open up another way of engaging with things or another person to you. So yeah, I'm very keen on how we don't explain so as to explain away, but discern and ask, how can we approach all that as well?
Yeah, you're hinting there, and I think it's there in the book as well, that the previous scholars on Blake have often, as you say, tried to remain secure in their materialism, or they don't want to interpret William Blake as a religious character, as a religious visionary. Um, why do you think that's been such a blind spot? Is it just that's the way secular scholarship has gone? Why is it that we've up until now been unwilling to embrace Blake in the way that you are?
Well, you mentioned fideism, which was big in his time. So this is the idea you
Mm.
just sort of take a leap of faith and don't really ask much more. You try and live a good moral life, perhaps, but in terms of actually experiencing life differently, you know, don't ask too much. And that's related also to deism, which is the way that Blake writes about it. This idea that God is a wonderful cosmic engineer who shows up in, say, Newton's laws, but is distant as well, as Blake put it, a kind of Nobo daddy, set it going,
Mm.
but then disappears in the clouds. And this, I think, becomes a precursor to modern day atheism. There's a book that's published quite soon after Blake dies, I think in the 1840s, which is Feuerbach's The Essence of Christianity, that makes this famous reversal and says, you know, when we think about God, we're not doing theology, we're doing anthropology, we're just
Mm.
projecting some sort of ideal version of ourselves out into
Mm.
the heavens. And that book kind of crystallizes and constellates what Blake saw unfolding, and so tilts into atheism proper that really
Yeah.
doesn't get going until the mid-Victorian period in Europe. So I think that wider culture has deeply affected how Blake is read. And then, of course, what also happens is a sort of postmodern turn where people want to respect Blake, and they realize the richness. They realize it's not sort of sheer fantasy. He's onto
Mm.
something. It's too productive. It's too
Mm.
creative just to sort of ignore. But then they say, they put, as it were, the capacities of the divine into the human imagination and say, you know, well, look, the human imagination is an amazing thing. It's wonderful. It almost performs miracles. You know, it can
Mm.
see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower. And so all the work is being done by this isolated human mind. And
Mm.
I just find that completely implausible. And
Mm.
the reason is sort of twofold. One is that I used to work in a psychiatric hospital, and there you do work with people who have very rich imaginations, very florid, even disturbed imaginations, and yet it doesn't really go anywhere. It's sort of arresting at first, but then it even becomes a bit tedious and boring, to be frank,
Mm.
because you realize that people are trapped by that kind of imagination.
Mm.
Whereas, of course, someone like Blake has an imagination that draws all sorts of people in. And, the reception history of Blake is hugely diverse as a result. And so that is because I think Blake is bringing into focus this kind of great sea of imagination that we're all in our different ways relating to, and asking us, how can we become more aligned with that? How can we become co-creative with that? To use the words that is often used in this sort of different way of relating to the imagination. Yeah, so it's partly, I just don't find it. I think it's asking the isolated individual human being to do way too much. It's more of a miracle in a way than taking on the proper theistic view.
Yes, and if just to go back to that idea that Blake was living in a period of incipient atheism, shortly before Feuerbach comes out with his great book, um, did because one of the lines I always remember from Blake, binding with briars my joys and desires, when he's talking about clerics, what was his relationship with institutional Christianity, and what was his Christianity?
So we know he went to church 3 times in his life. Once was his baptism, once was his
Yeah.
wedding, and then I think the other time was his father's death. I mean, he may have gone another time, my father's funeral, but he wasn't a great churchgoer. But it was an age of great church going. All the Georgian churches with their box pews are clearly primarily designed to manage people
Mm.
filing into the pews. And this was an age when the Church of England particularly had a kind of monopoly on civic life. Essentially, if you wanted to be a civil servant, an academic, these kind of sort of middle society kind of posts, you had to very distinctly nod to the Church of England, and going to church was part of that. So there was a kind of, again, a sort of inverse anxiety about cultural Christianity, because you get like Dean Swift, Jonathan Swift, preaching sermons about, are you really listening to what we are saying? Are you tending to your soul, or are you just here for social niceness? So, full churches cause as much anxiety as empty churches do in some quarters now.
Interesting.
So he was a dissenter too, though, and his mother, interestingly, was a Moravian, and I find that again increasingly fascinating. And recent research, I should really give a call out to Suzanne Sklar here, who actually was one of my Blake teachers, because she's shown that Blake would have known of the Orthodox Church in London. There were Orthodox chapels. There was one particular Orthodox priest who was quite a society priest. And Blake, never lived more than a few minutes' walk from these places. And the point about the Moravians is they're from, Eastern Europe, Moravia, and they got their authority as a church not from the Protestant traditions or the Catholic Church, but from Orthodoxy. And
Mm.
so, we know that his mother was a very keen Moravian. There's records of her with her that show her involvement. And so, they would have read figures like the Church Fathers, as well as the other things that Moravianism is known for. And this comes up in Blake, too, in a very early pamphlet called There's No Natural Religion, which, in brackets, is a railing against the idea that you can explain these things naturalistically. He concludes that pamphlet with a great plate that, right across the whole plate is the phrase, therefore God becomes as we are, that we may be as he is. And this is a phrase that is repeated like a bell tolling across the early Christian centuries in the Church Fathers, figures like Leo the Great and Gregory of Nyssa and others. And so, that Blake almost directly quotes them in his summary of what he feels true religion is about. To me, speaks to the fact that although he wasn't a great churchgoer, he was deeply integrated into, the richness, the fullness of theological traditions. He wasn't some private mystic sort of dreaming away, which is another way that he's sometimes presented. No,
Yeah.
the mind mattered to him quite as much as the experience. The two must weave together.
Mm. Mm. And in your book, you've got these lovely um, images of Blake that are obviously drawn from Christian inspiration. It'd be lovely if there's a couple of his of examples of his Christian imagery that particularly have spoken to you, or particularly reveal the Blake that you're talking about.
Yeah, no, thank you for those questions. So maybe I'll begin, with his sense of Jesus, because Jesus really is important, absolutely central, and again, a figure that tends to get sort of erased from discussions of Blake, but right from the earliest texts like the Marriage of Heaven and Hell, and definitely in the later texts like Jerusalem, the Emanation of the Giant Albion, Jesus is a pivotal figure. And one way, I mean, there's a lot you could say about this. I mean, one way that Blake highlights himself is that he felt that Jesus, as a kind of philosopher, introduced the notion of forgiveness into the tradition. And
Mm.
it's true that if you read Plato and Aristotle, they don't discuss forgiveness. It would be a sort of offense to justice for them,
Mm.
because the sense there was that the cosmos needed rebalancing into a kind of harmony. And so forgiveness would just upset that harmony. Whereas forgiveness becomes, the key teaching of Jesus as this sort of constant release from what's gone wrong in order that you can learn from what's gone wrong and so become more fully aligned to God. This change of heart, metanoia. So Jesus is really important in terms of teaching, but even more deeply, I think he's important because Jesus is the figure in which Blake understands what he calls the human form divine, which is a meeting point of what he also called the contraries, the finite and the infinite, the temporal and the eternal, the mortal and the immortal. And in that meeting of the incarnation, as Christian theology calls it, Blake is one of these mystical traditions who sees that as almost a mirror of our own humanity, that we can begin to discover that we too are kind of in-between creatures, thriving in this zone of the imagination that enables us to bring together different worlds, the kingdom of God that's also here. So Jesus, is at once a historical figure with, as it were, particular things to say and do, but is also a figure that lives in us, that we can awaken to and so understand our humanity as well. So to link back to your first question about imagery, I mean, the one image that particularly comes to mind is Blake's painting of the woman caught in adultery, and this famous incident in John's Gospel. He paints dozens and dozens of images from the Gospels, and they always have a bit of a twist. And one highlight for me in that image is that when Jesus writes in the sand, as he famously does in the story twice, Blake paints Jesus also as bowing towards the woman caught in adultery. So it's an act not just of contemplation, but also of reverence for her. And I think in that moment, she's realizing her liberation, which is a kind of judgment. It is saying, do you know who you really are? But so as to liberate her, because the human form divine, as Blake puts it, that was in Jesus is also in her, which Jesus is acknowledging. So that's one image. But there's another side to this, which Blake also captures in other ways. One is, there's one image of the crucifixion that Blake paints. He paints quite a few, but this one I have in mind. Jesus is on actually a tree, and there's light radiating from behind Jesus. And in front is a figure, maybe Blake, maybe Loss, but who's also cruciform in shape, whose arms are outstretched, mirroring Jesus on the cross tree. And I think this is Blake saying that we enter this perception of reality, this expansive mode, we awaken to it when we give up our sense of private, isolated, personal self. Sacrifice, that would be, again, the theological word, because then we become porous to more. And so the Christian path, and I think this is in the Gita as well, this is partly what Krishna teaches Arjuna, is by offering all that you have in order that all the more might become part of your participation in life as well. But it involves kind of relinquishing as much as receiving. And you can't possess in Blake. Possession is always a bad word for him. It's not like you can kind of accrue divine experiences. Your inner divinity is not yours to have and hold. It's yours to step into by giving back, which of course is what the divine does by pouring life into creation. And so we're constantly sort of dying to ourselves, small self, in order to discover this wider self of which we're a part. And Blake talks a lot about selfhood and how that selfhood is the sense that it's yours to have and hold, and that must die. He talks about stepping into death. Anyway, but picking up your cross is the biblical way of putting that, and so he depicts that in this image of the crucifixion with the onlooker imitating the cruciform shape.
Beautiful. And he starts to see in his day, one of his concerns that comes through really clearly in the book is that people in his own time are on a dangerous trajectory. They're on a trajectory, or society, Western society is on a trajectory away from living in that kind of reality, that various things are changing in London, in Britain, in his time, which cause him to worry. So either implicitly or even explicitly, he's a bit of a social critic. Could you give us a flavour of what he worries about? Because I think some of that, in your understanding, actually parallels where we are now, or might be headed. Perhaps you could flesh that out a bit for us.
I mean, I guess, Chris, you're talking about, say, the beginnings of emergent consumerism.
Yeah,
Would that be one?
consumerism, the direction of the natural sciences, technology, potential for alienation from nature. I mean, what's interesting, just briefly, because we were talking about Asia before, one of the really big themes when Asian spiritual teachers, in their own right, head west a few decades after Blake's death and begin to, as it were, school Westerners who've lost touch with Christianity in yoga, various forms of Hinduism, etc. One of their big critiques is that for all the progress that Western society has made, there's been an enormous cost, which is alienation from nature, from oneself, from an ability to participate, you could say, not just in the natural world, but in this greater reality. And I suppose figures like Swami Vivekananda become well known for trying to offer people a way out of that. And I just wonder how much of that trajectory that by the end of the 19th century, Indian figures like Vivekananda quite clearly see as being characteristic of the West, how much of that trajectory is beginning in Blake's time, and perhaps he picks up on it and is trying to, in the title of your book, get people to wake up. How would you see that?
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, on the science side, and I come back to the consumerism, but on the science side, again, it's quite easy to portray Blake as against science. You know,
Right.
he loves Chaucer, Milton, and Shakespeare, and loathes Bacon, Newton, and Locke, sort of thing. But the fuller vision is much more subtle, because Blake, in a way, is a kind of scientist. The word scientist didn't actually exist in Blake's time. There's a sort of profession that you engaged, but a scientific endeavor in life was one that just tried to make things coherent and whole, and did experiment, and maybe made inference. And Blake the artist was as much Blake the chemist. He had to know about metals and acids and waxes and colors and all that kind of thing. If you went into his workshop, it would have been more like a chemistry lab, than a sort of beautiful studio. And I think that what Blake realizes, therefore, is that the risk is that the power that comes with the abstractions of science, so take something like Newton's law of motion, second law of motion, F equals ma, this extraordinarily simple, elegant formula that describes a vast array of phenomena, and moreover gives you a kind of power over those phenomena to guide them and cajole them and form them into technologies. Blake, I think, senses that is going to seduce us into thinking that the abstractions are actually real, rather than being a kind of refraction of reality that is useful in some ways, a bit like knowing what happens when you put acid on metal is useful. But that has always got to be in the service of producing the beautiful image. And the image is the real thing, not the acid dancing on the metal. Whereas I think that Blake felt that this process of alienation was beginning because the abstractions were so alluring that a kind of, I don't know, I think of it sometimes as a sort of perverse Platonism. You hear it when a mathematician might say, well, reality must be at base mathematical because maths is so powerful in terms of describing things. Well, it is in a certain way, but of course it loses a whole lot in the process. And particularly, we're not mathematical creatures, even though we can do a lot with maths. And so we lose ourselves if we're not careful. And I mean, it's interesting you mentioned, the latter figures like Vivekananda and others, because, around their time, or maybe just a touch after, you have these early pioneers of quantum physics, figures like Werner Heisenberg, Erwin Schrödinger, and they're deeply aware of these Eastern traditions. And someone like Heisenberg explicitly will say, we must avoid thinking that the science is real. It's not. But what it does do is give us a way of engaging with what's real, but to preserve our contact with reality. In Heisenberg's case, he particularly celebrates language. He feels that words have this resonance with reality. And so we mustn't dismiss words like soul, for example, he says, just because they don't seem to have a place in this scientific mentality. Because soul is the felt living contact with the reality we're trying to study. So I think that's that, that it, both in terms of the philosophy of science, not getting confused about what science does and doesn't do, but then also realizing that if you feel the abstractions are more real, which of course is easy in a society that becomes increasingly shaped by technology, because we're sort of living in an abstraction for much of our lives. And so
Yes.
we lose touch with nature and the wider world.
Yes, I must just quickly jump because we want to hear about the consumerist side in a moment. But there's a phrase that Carl Jung used. He was one of those who thought there was much we could learn from India, and in comparing the way people live in India to where people live in the West, he said that Westerns live in a madhouse of abstractions, which is such a resonant turn of phrase for what you're saying here. That direction of travel and where it's led us. So if that's one aspect of it, and it might be worth digging into that a little bit more later on, because I think it's such a profound idea and also quite a difficult idea for those of us who are perhaps so accustomed to living with abstractions that to have a clear sense of what it might be like to experience the world in some other way is maybe not so obvious. So maybe we'll knit back to that. But the consumerist element as well, was that another part of the way that Blake saw his times?
Yeah, look, thanks for that madhouse of abstractions. I not heard that quote before. It's wonderful. I'm going to have to work out where that is from, and as you say, get the fullest sense of it. But yeah, on the consumer front, he's a great reader of Adam Smith, and Adam Smith's one of these figures that I don't know is he widely read now? Everyone's sort of heard of him, but the Theory of
Yeah.
Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations, actually, they're very good reads, because they're full of observations. And one of the observations that Smith makes, that I presume Blake thought about, was about, he notices that in London there's a trend for wearing larger and larger coats. And I love
Right.
this observation because it shows you this is not some sort of abstract theory. It's a direct reflection on how people are living. And Adam Smith wonders, why do people want bigger and bigger coats? And then he realizes it's because in the emerging cash economy, cash is becoming more and more the mode of transaction in this time. Mercantilism, people working for cash, rather than to make things. In this new culture, you need to carry about your person all the signs that you're thriving in this culture. It's a kind of status anxiety. And a remedy for status anxiety. So you could reach into one pocket and bring out your lovely snuff box. You could reach into another and show your pocket watch. And Adam Smith laments this fact. He says, look, people are going to cause themselves a lot more suffering by trying to have all these things and wearing these bigger coats. But he thinks it's a price worth paying because what it will bring is progress, that it will, enrich the economy as a whole. And so it will make possible what we now call progress, material progress, which of course it does. But I think Blake's a lot more ambivalent. And the reason is because he recognizes that what consumerism is doing is twisting the divine desire for more that's in the human heart. And it's twisting it towards material goods rather than towards God. And Blake says at one point, nothing less than all will satisfy man. We're these finite creatures with a sense and taste for the infinite, as another near contemporary Friedrich Schleiermacher puts it. And so consumerism is so invidious because it takes what might lead us to the fullness of life and instead promises us the accumulation of trinkets as if that's going to somehow satisfy us, which I think is why it's so successful, why it works so well. It's spiritually very aware, but spiritually very devious as well.
Yes, at the same time. And in the book, I want to get on in a moment to the kind of practical takeaway for us in terms of perhaps living a little bit more, experiencing what a bit more like Blake did. But perhaps you could draw out the parallels if you see them between Blake's time and that direction of travel that was worrying him. and where we are now, or perhaps the parallels aren't so straightforward? How do you see them?
Yeah, I think that, another phrase that comes to mind, which I think is very fascinating in this respect, is this phrase "dark satanic mills." And again, at first pass, you might think this is a sort of observation that Blake's making, as if he's seeing the mills of the Industrial Revolution around and about. And, there were some mills, but it wasn't, the Industrial Revolution didn't really take off until, I think people reckon, the kind of 1840s, which is after Blake's death. And, but what he sees is the imaginative ground being prepared for that which becomes the Industrial Revolution. If you think about it, it's an enormous, incomprehensible, really, imaginative act to not just turn an individual, but turn a whole society, an economy, everybody's everyday activities towards the production of stuff on an industrial scale. It requires, nearly everybody to change their life. So it's a massive conversion that's been that's unfolding in the 19th century. And I think Blake, it caught this phrase, dark satanic mills, to express that conversion. But because he's a prophet, it feels, 200 years on, quite literal. The word satanic for him means opaque or contracted. He thoughts are both kind of living entities, and also states of mind in Blake. And so, worth giving a name. And so the darkness is the turning from the light. The satanic is the contraction. And then the mills, actually for Blake, is a metaphor for how we're understanding the cosmos. He says many times, we'll imagine the cosmos as many great wheels turning like cogs, as mills in the sky, as it were. But of course, if you feel the cosmos is like that, then that is a absolutely fundamental prerequisite for them building loads and loads of mills. Things like cogs and so on had existed in the ancient world, but no one thought to industrialize the ancient world because no one thought the cosmos was like a bunch of mills. Whereas now, emerging is this extraordinary transformation that again gives rise to many good things. That's part of the complexity. It wouldn't be so seductive if it was just purely dark. That's really not the case at all. But what Blake is onto is, and I think this is what he's asking us now, don't get just caught up with the ethics of things. That won't really take you very far, because the point is that if you say this is good, that's bad, it still keeps you in the same worldview that is existing, and probably just makes as many people feel guilty as it does liberated. What you've got to do is get in touch with the soul of our times and realize how it is limiting your soul, as well as, seducing it in certain respects. And then you're tapping into this desire that really can bring about change. And that's one of the things which I want to try and get across, that, we've got to engage with who we are again in order to address where we find ourselves in our relationship to the rest of the natural world and so on.
Yeah, let's dig into that then. Where does Blake offer us something, as it were, concrete? Concrete's maybe the wrong word. Let's say practical, in terms of discovering that participatory reality that you talked about a little while back. Did he see his art as having that role? Did he intend his art to be used as a bit crass, but experienced or enjoyed or embraced in that way in order to bring people into a sort of a greater participatory life? It wasn't just kind of nice doodles that he put out there because he had to earn a living. That there was something, almost an evangelistic quality to his art, or is that putting it a bit strongly?
No, it's not actually. Another thing which is sometimes said about Blake, he's imagined as this poor artist sort of stuck away, out of sorts, out of times.
Yeah.
There's a bit of that towards the end of his life, although he always had his patrons and followers, actually. And luckily for us, they kept the rumor of Blake alive, if you like. But no, he wanted to be like a Michelangelo. He wanted to make London like Renaissance Florence and being changed by great artworks. He wanted to paint great murals precisely to inspire the imagination. And so, he is on the side of the art critic that would say, I don't know, when, Van Gogh paints the sunflowers, he's revealing to us a side of the sunflower and therefore the sunflower as a kind of portal into a wider reality with its vividness, with its life, with its color. That is the role of the artist. It's the artist as prophet. Not in the sense of telling the future, but in the sense of opening up what's going on now. And so, asking yourself not just about the materiality of an artwork, which is, if you see an art program on the telly, they'll talk a lot about that, how it's related to other artists, the new technique, maybe some sort of new material that comes in, and that's fascinating in its own way. But that's all a preliminary to what's this work doing to you? Why is it good? It feels beautiful. What's that telling you? And so being bold, I think, and asking what might be heavily policed as kind of naive questions in certain circles, as if it's a bit, you shouldn't really ask questions like that. Maybe, an artwork matters because it makes a clear political point, and then we sort of feel comfortable because we're in the world that we understand. But of course, it's a bit deadening, just to constantly going on making political points. And so Blake's saying, no, where's the art that can guide us back into reality? And he wanted his work to be like that. It's why he, writes poems, but also presents them with the imagery around the poetry. He was a great musician as well, it's said. And, music does that, actually. Music's kind of harder to keep in the box of sensible material criticism, because it does rather plug into the heart. But that's one way, when if you go and see some, great work of art, don't be too put off by the useful but limited plaque alongside giving you the dates and, and situating it in one narrative. Ask the art, ask the work of art. What are you telling me? Where can you lead me? And then feel free to discern, but also run with your imagination.
It puts me in mind that approach of the English philosopher Alan Watts of the 20th century. He said, complaining that so much of Western art always seemed to have to be about something, that it was making a particular point. Whereas for him, East Asian art, the turn of a bird's wing or the blade of grass, it was, as you said, sort of inviting you into it. I think the way he put it, which I found quite useful, was that it's as though the artist has done half of the work or a certain portion of the work, and then there's the work that you offer of a contemplative kind that completes it. And so an artwork which is intended to be sort of entirely finished and about something and conveying some message, moral or political or otherwise, is in a sense a failure because it gives the viewer nothing to do and it doesn't invite them into anything. Whereas what you're saying with Blake, almost every work of his is that invitation, and it kind of requires something of us, perhaps. I would love to hear, because you've obviously spent so long now with his images, and you have a sort of contemplative practice of your own. I think I'd certainly find it helpful. I imagine listeners might find it helpful as well, if you could imaginatively sort of talk us through the process of being in front of a piece of art by Blake, whichever one you might choose, and as time goes by, what's that process like of, as you say, letting the art ask something of you or you asking something of it? Could you give us as almost a sort of a blow by blow of that for people that might not have encountered art in this way?
Oh, look, thanks for that. It's really worth pressing at these things, I think. And I think what happens is that, what habit I have is, if there's a work of art that speaks to me, I get a copy of it, a postcard or whatever, and put it on my wall, and then I live with it. And the way that I found helpful to live with it is almost triangulating the space between you and this image. And what I mean by that is that, you're looking on, its presence is before you. And what you're seeking to inhabit is almost the field that's created between yourself and the image. How can I sort of step into the felt life that the presence of the image before me stirs, that's not just in my head, but actually is a sort. I like the notion of fields. Fields were very big in Blake's time, electromagnetism and all that, and the idea of poles that, like a magnetic north and south pole, that are themselves but only in the service of the field. And so, I mean, I think you get it when you're talking as well, like a dialogue. I mean, I hope I'm feeling it. I hope you are, and maybe people listening in are too, that, we're doing our bit in this conversation, but in a way trying to speak to more than what we're saying, sort of stepping into the space in between us. And I think that is the key kind of spiritual practice. And it's why it relates to this, a certain kind of selflessness, not a moral selflessness, but a giving all you are to what's more than you. And then you find more of yourself in that sort of third space. There's a nice phrase which, for me, I again, to a bit of poetry that I've contemplated, which helps me here. Blake says, "There is a moment in each day that Satan cannot find." So this sort of contracted worldview, this moment that Satan cannot find, nor can his watch fiends find it. But the industrious find this moment. So this, to your point, this is an active stance. It's not passive. Blake says, that the observer view, which, the modern world tends to encourage, is actually passive. The active one is giving all of yourself to this observation. So the industrious find this moment, and it multiply. And when it once is found, it renovates every moment of the day, if rightly placed. And so what he's saying, I think, is if you develop this habit of actively stepping into the world around you that maybe is particularly revealed because of a work of art, because of a religious place, because of a conversation, then that can become a habit that renovates every moment of the day. You're constantly, is the word separate, stepping into this more. So again, contemplation is not just a practice you do first thing in the morning, although, I do that, and it's very important because it's about nudging yourself out of yourself, moment by moment, if you like. But it's just a preparation for wanting to inhabit more and more fully that wider reality again.
And perhaps let's finish on this. If there was, I'll put you slightly on the spot. If there was one piece of art by Blake with which people who want to try this approach that you're talking about, having it there in front of them, living with it, having this field open up. Because I imagine for people who've never tried it, it'll be a little bit tentative, a bit trial and error. They won't be sure if there's something happening or not. Is there a particular piece of his that would be a really good one to begin with, that perhaps that has a certain quality about it, that if we're beginners at this kind of thing, it would be well worth starting with?
Yeah, well, maybe there's two contrasting works that are very, very well known. So one is the Ancient of Days, which is this bearded figure leaning out of the clouds with a great pair of compasses in his hand. And then the other one is Albion Rose, which is this figure of a naked youth, sort of leaping, as it were, off the rocks with rainbow colours, coming from behind him. And so get a copy of each, and then sit before one and then the other, and then ask yourself what happens to your heart when you're before these images. And, without wanting to predetermine things, on the whole, I think that the Ancient of Days is a kind of contracting experience. It's partly the darkness. There is sun trying to break through the clouds, but it doesn't quite. There is a kind of motion of air through the beard of the figure, but the figure doesn't seem to notice. They're too focused on what they can contain in the compasses. And so it's a contracting experience that the image conveys. Whereas Albion Rose, it's dynamic. It's sort of full frontal and open. There's an innocence about it. There's the radiating light. In some versions of that image, and Blake actually paints a chrysalis that's broken free with a moth sort of coming out, an image of new life and resurrection. He was very fascinated. That was another bit of science, that he was very fascinated by the study of moths and butterflies that was big at the time. These imaginal discs in chrysalises were first being observed in the new technology of the microscope. So sit in front of Albion Rose and ask yourself, what does that do to my heart? And then, as it were, take the more expansive feeling elsewhere and see where that leads you.
Fantastic. It's lovely to have such a beautifully practical way of seeing what Blake can do for us now. Thank you so much. Best of luck with the book. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it actually made the way when I walked to pick up my daughter from school through nature, just what it's like to be in nature. I felt was changed having read this. So thank you very much, Mark, for your time. Thank you.
Hey, well, look, thanks, Chris. Thanks for saying that as well, because you know, you write to try and communicate something of the spirit, and that's the most important thing. So, I'm heartened to hear that as an early reader. Thank you for doing that as well. That was something of that effect. That's good to
Oh,
hear.
certainly,
Thank you.
yeah. It entirely succeeds. Brilliant. Thank you very much.